Good day, good afternoon, good evening, where everyone is. It would be really cool if we could say good morning if people were on the other side of the world watching this one day. So we have gone on a long journey together, and today I'm most excited about this one, not because it's the last one in the series, because it just means the end of one thing is the beginning of another thing. But this one really speaks to me where I currently am within my personal and professional life. Not because I'm reaching a conclusion of anything, but because it's allowing me to start sharing some perspective and some insights of things that I've been seeing both in a professional clinical setting, in an industry setting, and also kind of like a way of the world setting, because things are changing really rapidly, especially in the landscape of healthcare. And I want to thank each and every one who has been here live or who has been watching these, post-show recordings, for Jeff and everyone else who's made this possible, because this little endeavor really challenged me. This started as something where it was kind of like, oh, let's talk about the body, and oh yeah, the energy is a good starting point. And it just evolved into something very organically where we looked at the whole systems of the body in an integrated sense. And then as a result of me having to figure out how to take these education concepts and line them up with the product line that Master Supplements, US Enzymes, and Tomorrow's Nutrition provides the industry, we created this thing called the Master Philosophy, which was, in all honesty, a happy accident that turned into one of the greatest thought experiments that I've had in the last little while. And each month, this opportunity to provide some new insights, to connect the dots more, to build out this bigger overarching concept really brought me back to one of my first base principles. I once had a mentor tell me, Roland, the most valuable thing I can provide you is not knowledge or information, but it's perspective. Knowing what to look at, how to look at it, and why to look at it that way is essential. And I believe that we need this now more than ever in health, because think about the state of our healthcare system. I'll talk about this, in a little bit, but it is the biggest business. And other than if someone is in economics, that person doesn't want healthcare to change because it's incredibly lucrative, incredibly beneficial from an investment perspective. But in the United States, spending 4 times military spending on healthcare. And I don't see a massive tide turning. So let this be our little foray, throwing our hat into the into the ring, so to speak, of trying to change things. Because this is really about helping the humans. We're taking this concept, this philosophy, and trying to plug it into the respective areas, the disciplines, the practices where it sees fit. And I designed this in a way that anyone can take it and run with it in their style. And yes, you will become a better clinician and practitioner if you pair art and science, knowledge and application. But think about all the people that are struggling out there with their health issues that are not finding resolution. This is really what this is all about. And that's why I tried to make it in as many different facets as possible. You have your product guide, but you also have this kind of flow chart that by no means is this finalized. It's just kind of a thought experiment as to how to start with this if you don't know how to plug it into what it is you do, or if you just want to try it and test it in a variety of different ways. I think at some point we're going to take this division of 1A, 1B, 2, and 3, and evolve this infographic to have it as another resource or another tool that you can then use to explain to patients. Because a lot of people nowadays, more than ever, I think, are challenging the paradigm, and they're making their practitioners and doctors better. They're doing their own research. They're asking questions that I've never heard before. I mean, I had one woman talk to me about her mitochondrial function in deep detail recently, and that was never a thing 5-10 years ago. So the world of podcasting, the world of, I guess, pop culture has grabbed hold of health, and they've made it something that it never was before. And I think that's a huge tipping point for facilitating change, because if a clinician is being stumped by a question that their patient is bringing to them, it forces them to look at themselves and up their game and potentially go back to the drawing board and get a more expansive perspective of what it is they do in the bigger picture of everything. So to round out today, this is all I'm going to talk about when it comes to products. These are the tools of your practice, the art and science of client care, because it is not one or the other. You can have incredibly descriptive and deep science, but if you can't make that practical, well, then you're going to miss the execution of what to do when someone's in front of you. And you can have incredible intuition, but if you can't explain what or why you're doing to the patient, you're not going to instill a kind of confidence in them that's going to help their healing, because a state of mind, belief and emotional alignment are massive aspects that help that person heal themselves. It's never us. We just sometimes think we're taking credit for it in our minds. So this year really started with energy, and energy is everything, because it really is. I'll hit on that more today in terms of its concept, but then the cells to organisms concept, because I want to revisit those things one more time, because sometimes the best way to conclude something is to go back to the beginning, seeing how what we spoke about in January really has evolved, hopefully percolated in your mind, and how it fits our narrative even more than ever because of all the conclusions, evidence, and justifications that we brought forth this whole year with talking about the cell danger response and various other aspects of adaptive physiology and how it manifests itself in all of these chronic conditions, acute and chronic for that fact. And then we looked at the body systems after we did energy is everything. And really, I did it in a way that showed the interconnectedness from one to the other. And we'll talk a little bit about the whole specialization focus with medicine and how, there aren't a lot of generalists out there, and everyone's specialization sometimes leaves a blind spot in their purview when it comes to understanding that this organic robot that we walk around with is one complete coherent being. So after we did that, we got into the master philosophy, and it's, again, a framework. It's general, non-specific, but you can make it specific if you so choose. You do have that kind of power. And today we're focusing on reminding ourselves of the key perspectives we need to help our clients. And that's really my focus for today. Is it's taking all these concepts and not going super deep into looking at all the mechanisms of action, various transcription factors, what a potential lab test can say. Those things are essentially important. But if all of a sudden, you're running an organic acids test and you're looking only at succinic acid or malic acid and all these mitochondrial markers, and you're not looking at the proverbial forest through the trees, you might get so deep in the weeds that you forgot that you weren't actually in a garden anymore. You found your way into a park or a forest. Just kind of a nice little analogy that evolved in my head as I was speaking. So what we need to do is we need to take these concepts and then make them your own. Whether your specialty is in naturopathic medicine, allopathic medicine, functional medicine, muscle testing, biophysical energy or biophysics, whatever you do, you have to use your style, what you're passionate about, and you fundamentally can't escape the learning groundwork. What I mean by that is the human body, thankfully, is pretty static in terms of how it's been operating over the last few 100,000 years. So learning the body systems in a generalist sense is only going to help you become a better specialist, because you're going to see how all those pieces connect together. And then you're going to be able to put them in your own terminology, your own vernacular, the words that you are most impactful to use when it comes to explaining and empowering people that you're working with. This perspective really is lacking, and it really does make things dangerous. And I'm so over people in the health industry fighting whose way is better, or saying this is bad that that person does this, or this person is so and so and that person is this and that. Guys, girls, we need to come together and understand that we're spending so much energy not being integrative that we're not seeing how we can complement each other in the industry. And that's why generalistic approaches are so powerful, because you escape dogma, you escape strong bias, only to be able to have a more strategic bias when you come back to something like a specialization. So this metaphor is way more impactful for when other people can actually talk to me. But imagine I asked you how, if this woodland, if these woods were not well, if they were sick, as Mr. Jeff Thurston says, the woods in his area of Pennsylvania, he's told me, are sick. He speaks to trees. Which tree would you ask if it was actually problematic? Which one was causing the problem? Would we look at this little skinny guy here? Like, maybe it's a little crooked. Maybe we start there with a tree that's not necessarily, structurally ideal. Or would we start here with the biggest tree in the forest? The biggest one has to have the most impact, right? Obviously, it's taken up the most energy, it's grown the most, so maybe it has the largest influence. Or maybe we'd look at this lone ranger, ask him, why did he decide to plant himself or herself right in the middle of no man's land. This is what medicine does fundamentally. This is why we are so segmented. You can't look at a single tree to determine what the problem is in the forest. You have to look at the entire terrain to determine where the problem lies and why the inhabitants of that terrain are responding poorly. So these are just some of the medical specialties. And I think the fact that we have evolved medicine to the point where we can have this much specialization is absolutely incredible in one facet. You have these people who have so much knowledge in a specific discipline, but the issue is they don't necessarily know what the other knows, and they don't communicate. And these things really hit home when you have a personal experience with it. You know, I have a father who is very unwell. He has been suffering for most of my child and adult life. He has a gerontologist, he has a psychiatrist, and a neurologist. Do you think any of them have ever spoken to each other? It's so bad that at one point a psychiatrist reduced neurological medication without having a specialty in understanding the mechanism of action, and put him on something that was a known negative response in his history, and it caused a horrible drug interaction that left him unable to walk. So, you know, the metaphor continues. Medical specialty goes on, all of us studying unique trees, and if they came together, they would finally begin to see a forest. And I'm not saying that people in the alternative healthcare field are any better, because it's really about bias. And this is where we get stuck in our bias, and we look for protocols for isolated body systems rather than understanding how everything comes together as an integrated whole, because the term greenwashing is starting to move around our industry. And in many ways, natural supplements are better than drugs, but at the end of the day, the goal is to do the same thing. You're trying to either block a mechanism of action, accelerate a mechanism of action, remove something that's not supposed to be there, potentially add something that's missing that's supposed to be there. So throwing natural supplements at a condition is like finding novel solutions to sing to your tree without ever considering your soil's bad. You know, doing these weird things to your tree in hopes that it's going to grow without understanding the base foundational framework probably isn't going to help. So most medical professionals who move away from traditional practice or specialty, they never lose their ingrained perspective. And that's where this concept comes up. And this is my little, you know, nightmare that doesn't keep me up at night, but it's something that really does strike a sore spot in me. When I get an email or a question, this person wants to know what the protocol is for X. If someone's asking what the protocol is for a client, the advice of another medical professional, that person knows nothing about their client. They just think it's a gathering together of supplements that is this general thing that someone can just pull out of thin air without ever testing someone or knowing about their history, what they're wanting to accomplish. It's horrible health practice, in my opinion. And it doesn't matter what industry or what side of the fence you're on medically, it's not moving the needle forwards. So this is what I do really think we need. We need to get back to basics. We need to wipe away some of our dogma and bias. Take what's been incredibly beneficial from it, take what's been powerful and impactful for you, but understand that if we want to get people well, a larger, more expansive perspective like that of a satellite, rather than focusing on that of a microscope, is really what we need to do. So I did say we would return to first principles. So this is really, you know, what our meat suit is made up of. It's these contexts, or, you know, segmented aspects of us that we can reverse engineer back to something very simple and basic. But, you know, within each organelle, it's its own life form, it's its own entity. And we have a grouping of organelles that becomes a cell, which is its own microcosm. Those cells have their own ability to have an innate intelligence. They are able to communicate within themselves, communicate with each other. And when they gather together in a very strategic way, they become what's called the tissue. And that tissue somehow knows how to differentiate into being very strategically incorporated into what we call an organ. And that organ has its unique function that is in some ways isolated, but it then becomes integrated into an organ system where they rely upon each other to be an efficient flow of function and really of information, all based upon having enough energy. And then there's this organism, there's us, you know, standing there with that. The guy's got a pretty grim look on his face and he's probably a little embarrassed. He's wearing very small skin-colored shorts. But what happens when we have disturbances at the organelle and microorganism or cellular level? Well, we're really dealing with that when it comes to our professional understanding and interventions, but we have to know that it's showing up in the organism. And it's not going to show up in a way where that person's going to walk in and say, I have a 20% vitamin B2 deficiency, and I know my cytochrome C oxidase isn't carrying electrons optimally, so it's slowing down the proton gradient. They're going to come in and say, so-and-so, I feel awful. I don't feel right. Something's not right. I've been places, they've tested me, they say everything's fine, and it's in my head. This is what we're dealing with. So when we actually do lab testing, we also have to then know how can we, in context, place this stuff based upon the level we're looking at. Because the person is going to tell us of symptoms, or they're going to manifest dysfunction in a very specific area. We will be able to understand either the body or the organ system dysfunction. When we're looking at labs, we can test anything and everything nowadays. We can look at a stool test. We can look at a urine organic acids test. We can do a very comprehensive blood panel. We can do a genetic test. And I know people who test everything under the sun. And my question to them is, well, how do you then weight this? How do you take all of this information and integrate it in a properly structured analysis so you can get what's coming out from it? Because if you're reading it line by line, you've missed the whole point of functional testing, because it's a moment in time to tell you a pattern of manifestation that may have some degree of ability to look back in time, some degree of, I guess, educated assessment to go forwards in time if everything's been consistent. But if you're only testing at the biochemical level, you're not necessarily going as deep as you possibly need to. And then don't even get me started about biophysics. There are some genius guys out there who understand how energy integrates into physical matter. And I think that's where medicine is going to go. But coming back to first principles, if everything is energy status at this point will determine the influence of the outcome of a disease that shows up here. And these things, as we've talked about, never happen overnight. They don't happen within a couple of weeks and months, other than the few acute things, food poisoning, staph infection, what have you. If we're talking degenerative conditions of nature, then this has been brewing over a period of time, and we have discussed that the body compensates until it can't. So the whole idea is this model is really the elegant coordination of uninterrupted communication and integration. It's a lot of Asians there to say, to maintain all of this to be in tune. So it's like an orchestra. When all of these things are flowing effortlessly, there's a flow of energy, there's a flow of information, we have optimal function. And the goal of this is just to sustain life without disease. Disease is what happens when there's a blunting or a block in the efficient flow of what happens here. And I believe it's our job as clinicians to be able to better understand this. And it starts at the cellular level. Most people don't want to go back in their biochemistry textbooks and understand what each organelle does in a cell. But knowing that, it helps you understand the basic premises of what I call the balance points of life: growth and breakdown. From an energy perspective, having energy adequacy, having energy sparsity, having an optimal amount of electrolytes and nutrients versus having deficiencies and imbalancing the body's ability to sustain function. And we don't know enough to say that each cell is functioning at a very specific level. We're still trying to take these test parameters and these results that we get, and then we're listening to the person for them to tell us how they feel. So we have to think clinician, but speak client or speak human. And I love to use this gentleman down here. He is the world record holder for the 90+ region division in the 100-meter dash. And he has a few tips and tricks for life. And one of his things is to drink a pint of beer every day. And I think he looks better than a lot of 70-year-olds I've seen out there. So it's not all just food, diet, and supplementation. There's a lot more to this, because the human body doesn't just one day jump up and decide to become problematic for itself. I've separated into what I'm now looking at as the 3 different focuses. So the sense of self-identity, and this can be thought of from a personality aspect. If someone doesn't know who they are, they have a hard time going through the world. But I'm talking self-identity of the body's innate intelligence to recognize itself. Then there's the aspect of communication. Then there's the ability to repair. Disruptions in these things, I believe, move through this manifestation pattern. And we talked about this last time in the master summary's last phase. It starts as an imbalance. And an imbalance is what you see before you feel it. You can test it, but the person wouldn't know unless they've tested it. And from an imbalance, you go to a compensation because there's this built-in bandwidth of ability that the body has until it can't do that anymore. It can't mask it. And all of a sudden, boom, a symptom pops up. And that symptom is an early warning sign that you can now feel to tell you that something isn't right. But most people in the Western world ignore those things and just power through it or walk it off. And then you develop the pathology. And at some point, unfortunately, someone gathers the necessary aggregation of symptoms and they will put a label on it and give you a disease diagnosis and say, you have diabetes, you have cancer. And then that person is marked with that. But if you look at all of those conditions, they can somewhat fit into these manifestation aspects, right? So for me, if someone or something loses its self-identity, well, dysbiosis is a loss of microbiome identity. Autoimmunity is the inability to distinguish self from not self via the immune system. Cancer is the inability to maintain communication with the cells around, and all they know to do to survive is divide and replicate as fast as possible. How about communication? All metabolic issues are communication related, so is inflammation. If the body can't silence inflammation, the natural communication of resolution has been lost. And what's the downstream consequence? And if the ability to be, repaired is lost, well, that's degeneration and early death. And Master Supplements US Enzymes, our initiation point into this is the digestive system. Why? Because it's connected to everything. There's been no, development in the last, I would say, 5-10 years in the health field that has connected more to the development of disease than the gut and the microbiome and all the various axes of connection. And, if you want some specific examples of that, has anyone heard of, I can't ask you guys, but I'm assuming that you've all heard of something called quorum sensing. And for me, looking at the pattern of quorum sensing in the microbiome is the ecosystem and the microbes work together as a collective to be mutually beneficial to each other, which is a wonderful thing in the context of a healthy gut. And it's not a great thing in the context of dysbiosis and disease. And we as medical professionals are still so obsessed about killing things that are overgrown. Oh, I did the stool test and I have too much akkermansia, or I have too much this, I have too much that. It's like, well, maybe we're looking at that wrong. Because if we're killing things, then we're disrupting the collective, because the quorum sensing is done to be mutually beneficial for the microbiome and the host. So if you imbalance the ecosystem by throwing a bunch of antibiotics in there, you've altered the terrain, which means the home for these creatures has been disrupted. So when you alter the terrain, you also alter the mucosal lining where they adhere to, you alter the ability for the immune cells to not make too many antimicrobial peptides. So therefore, the profile of life in the microbiome has been changed. And now you've created a mismatch for that environment. You have opportunistic pathogens potentially overgrowing. You have things like yeast, potentially parasites invading because the opportunity prevents itself. I mean, they were there, they just kind of got woken up and activated. So the integration and the identity of the ecosystem breaks down. So when someone is perpetually using antibiotics over the course of the years, they're destroying their microbiome sense of self. On the other side, if you know how to, as a clinician, with the appropriate regenerative interventions, you're pushing the signal of the body's ability to find its way back to self. Because taking a probiotic all of a sudden doesn't make your microbiome look like what the label on a probiotic says. It potentially creates the opportunity for us to find our way back to our own unique microbiome print, or something close to that of what it was before we had the experience that destroyed that identity and sense of self. And this isn't just happening within us, like it's as above, so below, as within, so without. I love the 7 Hermetic principles, because what do you think happens to the planet and the soil systems when we're spraying glyphosate on our crops to make sure that we don't lose crops to, pests and insects? I mean, this guy's wearing basically a full-blown hazmat suit to deal with some, what is that, kale, some cabbage. So the average quantity of glyphosate in most non-organic pastas is only 120 parts per billion. I think that's a wonderful thing to feed to our children and to allow their microbiomes to become permanently disrupted, because we can see how those patterns come together. The research is there. So in the soil and with the plants, glyphosate acts as an agent of disruption. So it inhibits the pests to essentially sustain their life, but it also degrades the soil and the ecosystem in the soil. So the communication networks between the fungi, the bacteria, the various things that live in the soil cannot regenerate the soil properly. So it compromises our soil, and it leads us to not grow things without a ton of artificial fertilizers, which is not only destroying our topsoil, but it's making our crops very, very nutritionally sparse. We have no nutrition in our topsoil nowadays relative to what we did 50, 100 years ago. And I believe we only have, 60 harvests left in our topsoil. The average age of a farmer in North America is approaching 70 years old. Think about that for a second. But what happens when we eat the glyphosate? Because it doesn't stop there. What happens with nature happens with us, because we're linked. So if we eat glyphosate-rich foods, that in and of itself is going to cause microbiome disruption, because what glyphosate does is it impacts and impairs microbes' ability to synthesize various compounds from things like aromatic amino acids. And when you're not able to synthesize postbiotics, that's how the microbiome communicates with its environment, how creatures communicate with each other, how they communicate with epithelial cells. I mean, that's how we make tight junctions. Our genetics don't code for tight junction proteins very well. So it's the communication back and forth between the microbiota and the epithelial cells that, if it gets interrupted, we see an immediate reduction in tight junction synthesis and tight junction integrity. It's incredible that it's happening. So when it comes to the concept of self-identity, I think this is at the core. When the body is well, it knows how to do these things. It knows how to cellularly differentiate a neuronal cell and an epithelial cell. And knowing that each cell has a speed of replication, a speed of turnover, is a really important area to know based upon the goal of being able to heal a very specific thing. Right here, the body knows when it's not being itself. Those are T cells attacking a cancerous cell. So just knowing that the body is always trying to preserve itself is an essential paradigm of understanding when people are sick, what is it we're trying to do to push them back to a state of optimal homeostasis. How about communication? Well, we know cytokines are essentially immune modulators and chemicals of communication to direct traffic when there's a very specific threat or response. So if there's a stimulus and we want an inflammatory response, it's cytokines that drive that. But if you don't understand that cytokines have both a good and a bad side to them, meaning if it's a proper response, we got food poisoning and we need to direct traffic to kill the thing that's trying to wreak havoc in our bodies, that's wonderful. But what happens when this breaks down? Well, this is one of the impetus or the large influences of what's called autoimmunity. So when the body loses the ability to communicate with itself, it starts going rogue and attacking things. So we've gone from identity, as an example, now to communication. And it gets even, more microscopic. That's on a more macro body systems level. Within a cell, mitochondria are always communicating with the other organelles around. So if a cell needs enough energy to divide, it's the mitochondria and the nucleus that communicate with each other in order to send the signal that there's enough energy there, let's start the division process. But if there are energy issues, well, then all of the organelles that require enough energy start to become slightly dysfunctional, and the cell changes its behavior to that of being threatened, under siege, that cell danger response. So this communication is essential inside of the cell. And what happens when this communication breaks down over the long term? Well, weak cells, weak tissues, weak organs, you know how that story goes. And I wanted to think of how could I bring forth a very specific example. It's a very wordy slide, but let's go with this in terms of system-wide integration. So the simple aspect of taking a bite of food and turning it into energy, the amount of integration that is required in the body is astounding. So we think that we're chewing food, we're just starting the digestion process. Well, yeah, but we're asking the nervous system to show up. We're asking the hormone system to show up, because very few people think of hormones and digestion outside of insulin. And then we're asking all the secretory organs to have enough energy to secrete what it is they need to break down and digest the food. So once we've done that and the food is moving through our intestines, then it's really all about integration and communication again. So as food moves through our system, our immune system is perpetually looking at saying what is safe to absorb, what is potentially hazardous. The microbiome is breaking things down that the body can't actually naturally break down, and synthesizing various compounds to make its relationship with us, the host, more hospitable. And the body's ability to determine what is not self, i.e., say food to come in, and what is self that may look like the food is probably a large determinant factor as to why certain people with food sensitivities trigger various autoimmune flare-ups and attacks. So it's knowing that all of these body systems are so amazingly integrated, and just the simple act of taking a bite of an apple and getting that apple into your bloodstream requires all of this to gather itself together. And then once the food gets into the circulatory system and it's delivered to the cells based upon need, somehow the body needs to know what cells need more energy, which is an incredible thing. Well, then we have this, cellular receptor key and lock mechanism that we call insulin if we're eating carbohydrates. So when we eat carbohydrates, they float around in our bloodstream, and our body needs to somehow get those carbohydrates into the cells so they can be turned into ATP energy. And that's a simple thing where the pancreas then gets recruited to release insulin. Insulin will travel around the bloodstream and it will bind to the insulin receptor to essentially depolarize the cellular membrane and pull that carbohydrate into the cell where it can be transported to the mitochondria and turned into ATP. And then when this happens, the cell, because it's always communicating and watching within itself, starts to understand that the energy status has been increased. So it can turn on what's called mTOR, which is a building aspect, and flip the switch from a breakdown aspect when the cell is essentially starving. So all of these things come together just from us taking a bite of food and beginning the process of chewing. So all of these signals are needed to be able to be seamless, efficient communication, so this inner ecosystem can play its part and play its role of maintaining us as a healthy being. And if you think about something like type 2 diabetes, do you really think when you look at it this way that it's really simply just an insulin and a pancreatic problem? There is no such thing as an organ-based dysfunction that is in isolation, in my opinion. So it really does come back to the fact that it's really all about cellular energetics on a physical level. Energy equals life. And there was a really good podcast that I listened to with Dr. Zach Bush recently, and he left a statement with me that was just such a beautiful way of summing things up. It's a simplification, but without being too reductionist. When our rate of injury overwhelms our rate of repair, we start to manifest chronic disease. So the cells become compromised. When the cells become compromised, the body's communication system becomes stressed. And then we flip that switch on to the state of adaptive physiology, which, really is the body's ability to try and repair itself. So we go from a state of thriving to a state of trying to survive. And if this is happening under the surface over the course of years, at some point, something's going to manifest. And as to why certain diseases manifest in certain people, well, that's a black box. That's a mix of various aspects of environmental influence, genetic susceptibility, lifestyle patterns, emotional patterns, thought processes, dietary influences, activity factors, sleep debt, if you will, stress, various things like that. So when we're working with someone in a clinical sense, we do have to account for the total load of the burden. What I mean by that is this person who's in front of me, how unwell are they? How far away are they from optimal, from healthy, whatever healthy is defined as in your world? And what is the duration to which this burden has been there in existence? And that's one of the first questions I always ask people. It's like, how long have you been struggling with this stuff? Because it allows me to get a sense of how long it's been there. So how much am I going to have to work on finding the ability to put the right signals into the body so the body can find homeostasis and heal again? But it also sets the expectation for the client, because a lot of people, because they're not health specialists and they don't have the perspective of knowing how to look at something, coming back to that word, they have a false identity, false sense is probably a better way of putting it, of how quickly something can come back. And, coming back to the statement that I made, that the US spends 4 times that on its military on healthcare, I don't think we're going in the right direction. And I think right now is a very, very important time in our human history that we need to be able to somehow spread this message and empower people to not only be responsible for their own health and well-being, we need to be better as guides, as catalysts, to be able to understand the physiologic side of it, but then be able to give the client a lot more complementary and holistic care. So all of the inputs we're putting into the system are being well received. So the output can be healing, can be health, can be regeneration, all the things that we're trying to do. Because I do believe the wonderful part about what we do is we work with people. As a clinician, you're working with individuals. And that same mentor always used to say to me, Roland, so the person sitting in front of you, so what do you want to do? I look at the person this way more than I have ever before. And I think this is the natural route of where people go. The person manifests as physical problem or as a physical problem. They show up in your office because there's a boo-boo that they want a Band-Aid put over, metaphorically speaking. But I want everyone here listening to this to think about the people you see and ask, is there a pattern that I see with the people who have certain physical conditions in relation to their mental state? Is there a pattern in terms of their emotional well-being or the emotional patterns and behaviors that they demonstrate? Do they have some aspect of spiritual faith, greater belief in something, or are they so terrified of dying that they're giving themselves daily anxiety because they're over the age of 60? This is where we start. I think we start here with a physical, but when we're working with a person, they need everything that we can get to support them. And if it's not you who can provide this in a singular focus, bind together with other health professionals that complement, because there's an old saying that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think as you start working on people on the physical side of things, they're kind of they inevitably have to look at more facets of the jewel. They have to look more at what's going on with themselves. Because if you look at health as a concept, as a vibration, when you raise the vibration of health, things that no longer suit that vibration that are part of them, mental constructs, emotional patterns, they start to vibrate out naturally. Because if you have a healthier person, typically you have a happier person, you have someone who's more positively influential in the world. And, humans are kind of like tuning forks. Think about it. We're a column of water that can feel resonance. So if we're connected to other healthy, happy people, that's just going to influence us as a race to be a lot better in many ways. So from my clinical pearl is, starting with health, it's easy, it's tangible because people can hold on to it. But when you push one, you create space for the others to move. And I think this is really an aspect of the future of medicine, where you're integrating art and science of client practice with energy and various things that are really needing to find common ground. Because the words that I use to interface with all this stuff is coherence and resonance. And when you have a body that's in self-coherence, that body's in an optimal resonance to be able to manifest health. So my final thoughts with this whole thing, and then I wanted to leave a little bit of time for any questions that anyone may have. The whole philosophy of the master philosophy itself was created with the idea of authenticity and scientific integrity in mind. And I'll be the first to say, knowing that a supplement doesn't cure something, but a supplement provides a strategic input or a strategic influence for the body to be able to heal itself from something, that's like first principles when it comes to knowing how to strategically and optimally use supplements in a clinical setting. The better you are with your tools, the better the outcome of the job that you can actually create. So it's knowing those pathways, knowing the physiology, knowing the biochemistry, and understanding where something is really appropriate. And by no means do you have to use the master philosophy in its proposed order of operations. That's just an easy way to start with a very, very low likelihood for something going bad. Because my logic in starting it was, well, regardless of what someone's dealing with, when you improve digestion, everything gets better. But the scientific integrity piece is huge, because I don't know if everyone knows this, but there are some pieces of information in the health world that are not necessarily accurate. Shocking, I know. So how we approach things is we do what it is we do. We don't touch into areas or provide false expertise in what isn't our wheelhouse or isn't our specialty. But the more you can integrate and include these various things, as I said before, in your practice, it gives you a greater scope of understanding of what you can do for that person who's sitting on the other side of you asking for your help. It was also created in a way to be able to support every healthcare professional. And I'm hoping it's also a catalyst for people to get out of their comfort zones. Because if someone has spent years studying endocrinology, and they don't realize that there's 23 gastric hormones that are secreted every single time you take a bite of food and swallow it. That opens up a new opportunity to become even greater in your discipline, because you have a basis or a background of understanding that will fast track your ability to put more pieces together and potentially teach other people. With this, there's no claims being made. I'm not trying to address anything specifically, but by saying that, we can address potentially anything, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get what precipitates the development of degeneration. The reason people need pharmaceutical agents is they've gone past the point of no return sometimes. I don't believe that it's impossible to heal, but when we're getting into a game where you're taking a drug to deal with the complications and side effects from your other drug, that's not about regenerative medicine. That's about illness management. Traditional medical models are wonderful for crisis intervention. They do it better than anyone else on the planet. But with the standard of care on chronic disease, I think it's failing at a very rapid rate, to the point where it can't hide from itself anymore. The industry is talking back to medical professionals, and they don't want drugs. They want natural alternatives. I believe that's where everyone here comes in. So it really is your canvas to create what you wish to do with it, how you wish to integrate it. It's been an incredible opportunity for me to design this. It's been an absolute gift to test myself in terms of what it is I can actually put forth as quality content. I want to thank you all again, because this is not the end. It's not the rounding out point. 2022 was a few things. It was a thought exercise. It was an examination. It was a natural, organic evolution. I know it's a cliche word to use in health, but it really was. And 2023, we're going to dive much more deeply into practical aspects of healthcare, the integration of things that work alongside dietary supplemental changes, and really examining all of these things that we tell our clients on a regular basis. Oh, get some exercise. What does that mean? How much? How often? When is it too much? Talking about sleep, talking about various aspects that really do connect to the thyroid debacle book that we mentioned a few months back. So again, thank you everyone who's been part of this. I hope it's been impactful. I hope today's little examination and perspective and understanding that if you're looking at big picture concepts and you see everything in full clarity, clarity is where you really need to start from when you want to get into a more deeply descriptive and strategic focus. So the overarching satellite of clarity allows you to then pull out your microscope, look at things under that microscopic lens, and understand the points of integration. And hopefully, using the art and science of client care that you've been taught and given, you can then start to make inroads, and the condition with a name is no longer an intimidating thing. You realize it's just dysfunctional physiology that needs to find its way back to optimal. So with that, I'm going to leave it open for a few questions, a few comments. That was a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone.